Slavery has existed since the dawn of humanity. But when I mention the word slavery, I'm sure you don't think of the Spartans and their slaves. One specific era probably pops into your mind: American slavery, and even deeper, American Southern slavery. But American Southern slavery was just a tiny piece in a vast puzzle. Atlantic American slavery was not something just brought up in the 19th century. Slavery was the bedrock for major European empires for hundreds of years. It kick-started the economic ventures into a new world. Enslavement of Africans was for a specific reason, a financial reason. Millions of slaves provided the labor force to harvest the new gold of the world: cash crops, sugar, tobacco, cotton. These were goods the world craved, and centuries ago, those that created plantations to harvest such crops latched onto the most lucrative business of its time. So, I had an idea that took me way too long to think about. What if that slave institution never existed? The colonization of the Americas never involved bringing slaves to farm the land. No Atlantic slave trade. No African slavery. What would the past few centuries look like in a world where African slaves never came to American shores? I can just imagine the lovely, happy comments YouTube is known for. Whenever slavery is discussed, at least in America, it focuses on the human element. Cody, you say? How are you even going to tackle such a controversial and dark topic in world history? Well, Jimmy, I say, you take a month to think it through. The plight of the slave, the brutality of the journey, all are discussed in other sources that can teach the damage of slavery. For me, I don't want to focus on the brutality of the system. What I'm fascinated by is the effects those emotionless, bottom-line profits from slave-harvested sugar had on the world. Slave-based plantations dominated the economies of major empires that soon spanned the globe. The Confederates are pointed to as clinging onto slavery, but for far longer it was the Portuguese, Spanish, French, and English that built their wealth off of sugar colonies in the West Indies. It was how they could afford those fancy ships that blew each other up. I just find it fascinating such a controversial topic in history rarely has this aspect discussed. The financial, cold, calculating part that was the whole reason slavery was even a thing, and is never really talked about. Sugar profits fueled the foreign policy of the 17th century world and kickstarted economic ventures that led to countries we know today and events so important to our modern identities. So what if that was gone? Using my best historical knowledge, I've crafted a scenario detailing an alternate timeline. This is simply a brain exercise, a start to a conversation. I'm not acting like I'm some all-knowing person. This is simply one possible scenario out of the countless that could happen. So, before discussing the actual scenario, let's discuss some historical context, just for those that don't know much, if anything, about this entire topic. Centuries ago, sugar was the oil of the 16th century. As any Walmart shopper can tell you, sugar is addictive. This too was the story hundreds of years ago. The world market craves sugar. It's processed using a crop called sugarcane, a crop that can only be grown in tropical climates. Due to geography, sugar was rare in Europe. By act of the perfect storm, subprime real estate showed up in the tropical region of the West Indies. The thing about sugar production, however, was that it was very labor-intensive. That's an understatement. It was like a factory. The production of sugar was the equivalent of oil refining. It required a large workforce to do specific production line tasks to get an efficient product. The crystallized sugar. It was a hot and dangerous process. It started with the Portuguese in Brazil, who worked countless Africans to death in the mills like the secret little sociopath it was. The Portuguese had been building a coastal empire along the African shores. They tapped into a rich trade network in Africa where gold, ivory, and most importantly, slaves were plenty. Europeans didn't go around kidnapping Africans. African kingdoms sold slaves to Europeans. West Africans had always practiced slavery in some form. slaves were usually war prisoners from people more inland. Those slaves interested Europeans who needed a new labor force to cultivate their crops. Eventually, other Europeans like the English and French discovered Portugal's secret and began trading in Africa as well. A triangular trade system began to develop. While this is mentioned in history classes, it's very understated. Slaves worked the land to farm products, those products would then be sold to markets around the globe, and those profits buy more slaves from Africans, and the cycle continues. When imagining a different world in alternate history, there's something that always has to be worried about: the butterfly effect, where one event affects another, which affects another. Like without World War I, World War II wouldn't have happened. When imagining a world without African slavery, it's more like a house of cards. The use of slave labor was the bottom set of cards. Remove that, and all the profits from that labor, which led to most historical events of the last few centuries, is entirely changed, leading to a history pretty much alien to what we'd imagine. Events like the War of Austrian Succession, 7 Years' War, American Revolution, French Revolution, the centuries of complicated monarchies, which don't seem to matter at all changed by this one event never occurring. Now you know why this took so long. So let's begin to imagine this alternate scenario. There's only one thing changed. Europeans simply never consider Africa as a viable source of slave labor. There is no trade of blacks to colonies. We have to start off somewhere. So let's start off in an alternate 1640. By this point, it's been more than 100 years since Columbus sailed to the New World. The Portuguese and Spanish have empires spanning across Latin America. The English and French have some too. The Spanish and Portuguese got a head start. The natural resources and people of the Caribbean was running dry, and so they began to grow crops like sugarcane and tobacco because you have to do something with the land. At first, these plantations used native labor, but there wasn't enough natives on the island to be a reliable source of labor to build a vast colonial economy on. In our timeline, the empire solved this labor shortage by trading with Africans for Africans. Without any Africans, who will be the labor force? The only choice was between two groups: natives or colonial Europeans. Natives were dead, and going to foreign lands to farm wasn't the most attractive offer to Europeans. Even if it was, there wasn't enough Spanish, British, or Portuguese to make up the millions of African slaves that populated these lands in our timeline. Mostly Brazil. Oh, Portugal. In this alternate world, colonies have to deal with something we wouldn't have imagined: a labor shortage. See, when companies look to invest in new lands, they want to maintain a profit. Well, if there is a lack of people to work, the venture is riskier. Sugar mills are expensive and sugar prices are risky, but that risk is balanced out by free slave labor to cut costs. Colonies were an investment, and sugar production were payoffs. Cody, you say, why are you focusing so much on sugar? Well, Jimmy, or Billy, whatever, 75% of African slaves that went to the Caribbean went to sugar mills. So for centuries, it was the crucial profit maker for pretty much everybody. In this alternate timeline, without slaves, sugar production could not reach the heights of our own timeline. It is simply too labor intensive. It still exists, rest assured, but the cost of production means it certainly wouldn't dominate the market. This would bring the land value on these islands down, kind of like Kuwait, without oil. And if Kuwait didn't have oil, would Saddam have invaded it? Without all those slaves, the New World has a far smaller population. Islands like Jamaica, Hispaniola, and Cuba see their populations be made up of Spanish, British, and French colonists who willingly made the journey to these lands. They'd remain culturally connected to their home empires and even the states across the Narrow Sea. If we had to imagine them today, the Caribbean would be like a collection of European-like states. Slavery was a social force that reinforced ideals that whites were natural owners over blacks. This persisted for centuries. So the conclusion is, in this alternate world, the social relations between blacks and whites would obviously be better. In this alternate world, while yes, there is no popular idea about how enslaving Africans was a natural good, this doesn't mean that there would be tolerance and sunshine. Writing this part of the video was basically like going through a minefield. Even if I missed a mine, I'd still step on the ground and probably explode. After researching and theorizing, my conclusion is even if African slavery and other race policies never happened, human society is actually even more split by race. It's a trade. While in this alternate world, there isn't a policy that Africans should be viewed as subservient, like in the pre-Civil War South. Instead, in this world, Africans are simply not thought about at all. Slavery introduced blacks into the social caste of European society. Without it, there is no region where both races interact daily, except maybe in Africa. Now, this needs to be explained. Slavery occurred because Africans were already viewed as lesser, as not fully human. In fact, in medieval times, Africans were one of those mysterious species who couldn't be Christian. Blacks were just as human and satanic as the mythical Cyclops men, or blue-skinned people of faraway lands. People wouldn't believe that Africans were a mythical species forever, but this shows that chattel slavery wasn't the genesis of racial tension. It was only a byproduct. This alternate timeline sees race relations simply go from one extreme to a broad exclusion. Now, why would this happen? Wouldn't Africans be eventually included into European society? Well, no. In the 19th century, even though blacks were in the United States, they were still considered foreigners of a kind. And even abolitionists, Abe Lincoln before the Civil War, believed after slavery ended, blacks would need to leave America for Africa, as they would always be foreigners. If even in our world, where blacks outpopulated whites in some areas and they were still viewed as foreigners, this would even be more prevalent when Africans don't even populate America. The only reason this inclusion occurred at all was because of the interaction between different races and the civil rights movement. It changed the way races were viewed across the West. The civil rights movement used this connection to the land to show that blacks had been in America for centuries and were just as American as whites. Now, this didn't end racism or anything, but it represented a precedent that blacks had connection to the land. Why is this important? In this alternate world, the only people settling North America, maybe even an independent United States, is Europeans in some form. British, Irish, Germans, Poles, Russians, you get the point. Even with all these new immigrants, the one immigrant Americans would never see is an actual African. What this creates isn't a culture of institutional racial hierarchy. It just creates a nation which really never thinks about minorities at all because there isn't any. If anything, the only thing that would continue is the tension between Catholics and Protestants, or Germans, Irish, or Anglos. That'd be the ethnic tension in the US. The African, who never had a sizable minority in any European nation, is just never considered a citizen, like the Chinese in California, a perpetual foreigner. A tribalistic view of the world involving the European realms of North America, the coast of Brazil, Australia, the Caribbean, and Europe. With no civil rights movement of the 1960s, this idea never goes away. If we were to look at an alternate 2017, the US is pretty much entirely European descendants. This lack of Africans means the concept of the 18th and 19th century of race and country doesn't leave. White man's burden still exists in some form as colonization occurs throughout the world for resources, and that really just stays the same. So it's a weird limbo where downright institutional racism doesn't exist, but instead it's just apathy, and maybe scientific racism and eugenics too. God, this video is not going to be popular. Now, while the Caribbean doesn't grow much without slavery, the American South doesn't have this issue. The 13 colonies were a much more appealing destination to colonists than a random island. So while there is never these sprawling plantations, the South is populated by smaller tobacco and cotton farms worked by indentured servants or paid white laborers. In this alternate world without much going for it other than agriculture, the power dynamic between North and South is entirely imbalanced. Before the railroad, the North frankly got the better real estate, the Great Lakes, and so they were able to industrialize faster. Without the finances from cotton, the South is left in the dust as the North outcompetes in finances, population, and technology. Europe. Cody, why are you sighing? Well, Jimmy, the issue when talking about slavery is those profits, and what those profits helped to build was European empires. Those empires weren't simply across the world, but wars against one another, including the 7 Years' War, War of Austrian Succession, Napoleonic Wars. You get the point. Going back to my House of Cards statement, it really is like pulling the rug from all of these events. Because so much changes, I can only theorize in very broad terms. Since European attention shifts from the Caribbean to the continent, it also shifts from North America to the rest of the world. Sugar forced Europe to focus on a very small section, the West Indies, instead of simply spreading out to other richer areas like India. For the next few centuries, European empires are focused on the much more profitable Asian trade than American colonies. This is reflective in their foreign policy. The Dutch would have to compete for the East Indies since France and Britain aren't fighting each other over the West Indies. Yet, since we're talking about African slavery, well, what happens to Africa? The slave trade was a double-edged sword. It made coastal kingdoms who captured slaves extremely wealthy, but it also depleted the continent of 10 million people. Short-term, slavery was fine for Africa, but long-term, it brought on an apocalypse. In this alternate timeline, without slavery, Europeans trade with Africans, but just not as much, as there is no slaves. This doesn't mean that these African kingdoms would still survive, though. Frankly, even without slavery, the Industrial Revolution still would have occurred, even if it was just centuries later than in our timeline. Africa would then be colonized just like in our own. West Coast African kingdoms would then become client states to industrial-era Europeans. In a world without the African slave trade, that centuries of forced human migration and trade wouldn't have happened. The European empires never would have made immense profits from their sugar colonies and instead would have focused on old world lands for investment. The issue of race is never really brought up because there was never a sizable minority of any race to bring that to attention. Instead, the world is divided among nationalistic and racial bubbles. The reason why this video took so long to make was because of one thing. How do I even tackle a topic like this? When you talk about slavery or any race-based content, it's a firestorm. What do you think would happen in a world where the Atlantic slave trade never happened? I'm sure you all will display your opinions in the comments. Next up, Southern Victory, Part 3. Perfect timing, America.